All right, welcome back for another deep dive. Sometimes I wonder about things like, why do I make certain choices? Is it all learned or something else going on? Today we're going to look into something that might actually make you rethink how much control you have over your decisions. I'm talking about the link between your genes and your behavior.
Fascinating stuff.
Yeah. Specifically, we're going to look at how these tiny variations in your DNA can influence the way that you make choices.
It's really fascinating because we're not just talking about simple things like reflexes. We're talking about complex decisions like how you learn from experience or how you react in these really high-pressure situations.
And the research paper we're exploring today is really interesting. It digs into some really cutting-edge methods that scientists are using to try and untangle this incredibly complex relationship, between genes and behavior. It makes you realize that it's not as simple as saying this gene makes you do that.
Exactly. It really isn't. And you brought up the word control, which I think gets right at the heart of this challenge, because behavior is so complex. It's influenced by so many things like your environment, your upbringing, your thought processes.
Right.
It's really almost impossible to isolate the role of genes.
So how are researchers tackling this complexity? It's almost like trying to find a single grain of sand on an entire beach.
That's where computational models come in. So they're kind of like this amazing tool that helps researchers bridge the gap between the world of genes and the world of, you.
So they're basically acting as a translator between DNA and decisions.
Exactly.
How do they actually work?
Think of it like this. Trying to understand a super complicated machine, you wouldn't just look at the whole thing at once. You'd break it down into its parts, right, to see how they interact. And that's what these cognitive models do with behavior. They dissect it into smaller pieces. For example, how much weight do you place on rewards? Or how do you react to risk? And by breaking down behavior this way, researchers can get a much clearer picture of how variations in your genes might be influencing those individual dials and knobs.
So it's like they're creating a recipe for behavior, breaking it down into these core ingredients so we can see how each one is affected by your genes. It's not just about finding some random gene that's linked to behavior. It's about looking under the hood to see how the whole system works. Are there any examples of how this has actually been helpful?
Absolutely. There's one study that looked at how variations in genes related to dopamine, the chemical messenger in the brain, were linked to how people learned in this strategic game.
Hold on. So you're telling me that variations in my genes could actually influence how I learn from my mistakes? That's kind of freaky.
It is kind of freaky.
But also really cool. Our genes are shaping our learning style.
What makes it even more interesting is that these findings actually link back to our understanding of how those genes affect the brain. So, for example, some of these genes seem to influence dopamine levels in the prefrontal cortex, which is this part of your brain that's involved in planning and decision-making, while others influence dopamine in the striatum, which is an area associated with learning and habits.
It's like those specific genes are fine-tuning different parts of the brain that are involved in learning. But even with these models, isn't analyzing genetic data still incredibly complex? It's not like we have just a handful of genes to look at.
Right, and that's where the concept of gene pathways comes in. And this has been a game changer for how we analyze genetic data.
I've heard that term before, but could you explain it to me again?
Okay, sure. Instead of focusing on a single football player, you're looking at the entire team. A gene pathway is basically a group of genes that work together to achieve a specific goal. So they each have different roles, but they're all collaborating to make something happen. So instead of trying to find the one hero gene, we're looking at how the whole team works together to influence your behavior.
So instead of focusing on the quarterback, you're looking at the entire offensive line, the receivers, the coaches, everyone who contributes to scoring those touchdowns. That's what studying gene pathways is all about.
Exactly.
Understanding how all those genes work together to influence your behavior. This makes so much more sense now. I feel like we've covered the basics pretty well. Can we dive into a specific example to see how these concepts of cognitive models and gene pathways come together in practice?
Absolutely. The paper we're looking at today highlights a 2014 study by Sett and his colleagues that focused on how genes influence strategic learning, particularly when you're in a competitive environment.
Strategic learning. What does that even look like?
Think of it as decision-making on hard mode. So it's not just about learning from your own successes and failures.
Right.
You also have to try to anticipate what your opponents are going to do and then react accordingly. So imagine, a game of chess or negotiating a business deal.
Yeah, I'm starting to get the picture. But what did these researchers actually find? How did they even study this?
So they had people play a game called a patent race.
Okay.
where they had to make decisions in a competitive setting to try and outsmart their opponents and win the most rewards. And to analyze their behavior, they used a cognitive model called the Experience-Weighted Attraction Model, or the EWA model for short. This model breaks down strategic learning into two key parts.
Okay, let's break those down. What are these two key parts?
All right, so the first one is called belief learning, and it basically captures how well you can anticipate and react to what other people are doing. Can you accurately predict what your competitor is going to do next? Do you adapt your own strategy based on that prediction?
So it's like a measure of how well you can get inside someone else's head.
Exactly.
That's pretty cool. What about the second one?
The second one is called learning rate, and it captures how much you prioritize recent experiences versus past ones when you're making a decision. Are you quick to adapt to new information, or do you tend to stick with what you've learned before, even if it's not working so well anymore?
So it's all about how you incorporate new information into your strategy.
Yeah, exactly.
Makes sense. Now, where do the genes come in? How did they connect these learning styles back to specific genes?
All right, so here's where it gets really fascinating. The researchers focused on the dopamine pathway because, remember, it's crucial for reward learning. They found that variations in genes that affect dopamine levels in the prefrontal cortex were linked to differences in belief learning.
The genes that affect dopamine in that planning and decision-making part of the brain, they were influencing how well people could anticipate their opponent's moves.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
It is amazing.
It's like having a genetic advantage in a strategic game.
It is. And what about learning rate? Well, that was linked to variations in genes that affect dopamine levels in the striatum. Remember, that area involved in habits and learning from rewards.
So the genes that affect dopamine in this part of the brain, they were linked to how people adjusted their strategies based on new information.
Yeah.
That really shows how specific these effects can be.
Right.
It's not just about dopamine in general, it's about dopamine in different parts of the brain playing different roles.
You got it. And get this, previous research had actually shown a connection between belief learning and activity in the prefrontal cortex and between learning rate and activity in the striatum.
So we're seeing a link between these specific gene variations, activity in specific brain regions, and then these very specific aspects of strategic learning. That's wild.
And remember, all of this is happening in a competitive environment. So we're talking about genes potentially influencing how you learn and make decisions when the stakes are high.
You mentioned that the researchers in the strategic learning study dug even deeper into the functionality of the genes that they were studying. Can you tell us a little more about what they found?
Of course. They were particularly interested in understanding how those dopamine-related gene variations actually affect the proteins they code for.
Okay, hold on. When we talk about the functionality of a gene, what exactly does that mean?
It means we're trying to understand what that gene variant actually does at a biological level. Does it change the structure of a protein? Does it affect how much of a certain protein is produced? Does it alter the way a gene is regulated? These are the kinds of questions that researchers are trying to answer when they investigate functionality.
So it's about going beyond just knowing that a gene is associated with a behavior and figuring out how it's actually exerting its influence.
Exactly. And in this particular study, they found something really interesting. Out of all the gene variants they analyzed, only one was associated with a change in the actual structure of a protein. And that was the well-known RS468 variant of the COMT gene.
Wow, so all those other gene variants, even though they were statistically linked to those learning parameters, they didn't seem to have a direct impact on protein structure.
That's what the findings suggest. Now, it's important to note that this doesn't mean those other variants aren't important. They could still be affecting gene regulation or other processes that we don't fully understand yet.
Right, it's like a puzzle where we've only found a few pieces, but those pieces are starting to give us a glimpse of the bigger picture.
Exactly.
And the research doesn't stop there, right?
Yeah.
There are other ways to investigate the functionality of those other gene variants.
Absolutely. There are now sophisticated computational methods that researchers can use to try and uncover the potential biological functions of these genetic variations. They can look at the DNA sequences surrounding these variants and search for patterns or clues that might hint at their function. It's like detective work, using computational tools to sift through the genetic code and look for hidden messages.
That's such a cool way to think about it. So even though we've made some incredible progress, there's still so much more to uncover. And as these research tools become even more powerful, who knows what mysteries will unravel about ourselves and this amazing complexity of human behavior.
And it's this kind of detailed analysis that will ultimately help us understand the intricate mechanisms by which genes contribute to the amazing complexity of human behavior.
This is starting to make me think about all sorts of things.
Yeah.
Like, could this research help us understand why some people are naturally better at things like poker or chess?
That's a really interesting question, and it shows how this research can really make you rethink how much of our behavior might be influenced by our genes. And it's important to remember that this is just one example
Okay.
of how genes can influence these complex behaviors. There are so many other pathways and mechanisms that researchers are just beginning to explore.
Yeah, it really feels like we're just scratching the surface here.
Yeah.
But what's so exciting about this approach is that it's not just about finding a gene linked to a behavior. It's about understanding the how and the why.
Exactly.
Like, how do those genes actually work to influence the brain?
Mhm.
And why do those variations lead to these differences in how we think and act?
Exactly. It's about moving beyond this gene hunting and into the realm of understanding the actual mechanisms at play. And that's what will ultimately lead to more effective interventions, whether it's through personalized therapies or behavioral interventions, or even just giving people personalized advice and support.
So you're saying that understanding these mechanisms could potentially help us develop better treatments for things like mental health conditions.
Absolutely.
That would be incredible. Imagine a future where treatments are tailored to your unique genetic makeup, maximizing their effectiveness and minimizing side effects.
It does. It really highlights the potential impact of this research. But at the same time, it's important to remember that this is still a relatively new field. There's so much more we need to understand.
Right, it's like we've discovered a new continent,
Yeah.
but we've only explored a tiny fraction of it. But even with what we know now, it's already changing the way we think about this connection between nature and nurture. It's not about one or the other.
Right.
It's about how they constantly interact and influence each other.
It's about understanding that your genes provide a blueprint, but the environment you're in, your experiences, your choices,
Right.
all of that shapes how that blueprint is ultimately expressed. It's this dynamic interplay that makes each of us unique.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And it brings up something I've been wondering about. We've been focusing a lot on dopamine and how it's affected by certain gene variations. But is dopamine the only player in this game? Are there other neurotransmitters or brain chemicals that could also be involved?
Oh, absolutely. Dopamine is definitely a key player, especially when it comes to reward learning and decision making. But there's a whole symphony of neurotransmitters in the brain, each with its own role to play. Serotonin, GABA, these are all involved in shaping our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. And researchers are starting to investigate how genetic variations might influence these other systems as well.
So it's like dopamine is just one instrument in the orchestra, but there's a whole ensemble playing a complex and beautiful piece.
That's a great way to put it. And as we learn more about how these different systems are interconnected, we'll gain an even richer understanding of how genes and the environment work together to create the tapestry of human behavior.
That makes a lot of sense. But I want to go back to something you said earlier about personalized medicine. You mentioned that understanding these mechanisms could lead to better treatments for mental health conditions. Can you give us some specific examples of how this might work?
Sure. So imagine someone who's struggling with anxiety.
Okay.
We know that anxiety can be influenced by a variety of factors, including genetics, life experiences, and brain chemistry. Now, let's say researchers identify a gene variant that affects the production of a neurotransmitter called GABA,
Okay.
which is known to have calming effects in the brain. If someone with anxiety has this gene variant, it might suggest that their brain is producing less GABA than it needs. And this could potentially open up new avenues for treatment, such as medications that specifically boost GABA activity or therapies that focus on increasing GABA production naturally.
Wow. So it's like having a personalized roadmap for treatment based on your unique genetic makeup. That's amazing. But I imagine there are also some challenges that come with this kind of approach.
Of course. One of the biggest challenges is simply the sheer complexity of the human genome. We have thousands of genes, and each gene can have multiple variations. Figuring out which variations are relevant for a particular condition and how they interact with each other and the environment is a massive undertaking.
It's like trying to solve a giant puzzle with millions of pieces. It must take a lot of time and resources to sift through all that data.
But fortunately, technology is advancing rapidly. We now have incredibly powerful computational tools and techniques that can help us analyze these huge data sets and identify patterns that would have been impossible to see just a few years ago. And as these tools become even more sophisticated, we're likely to make even more breakthroughs in understanding this complex interplay between genes and behavior.
What are some of the most exciting developments on the horizon in this field?
There are so many exciting things happening right now. It's hard to choose just a few. But one area that's really starting to take off is the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning to analyze genetic data. These algorithms can sift through mountains of information and identify subtle patterns and connections that would be impossible for humans to see.
So it's like having a super-powered research assistant that can help us make sense of the incredible complexity of the human genome.
It really is. And these AI-powered tools are already helping us to identify new gene variants associated with a variety of traits and conditions, including mental health disorders, personality traits, and even things like cognitive abilities.
So are you saying that someday we might be able to use AI to predict things like someone's risk of developing a mental health condition or their likelihood of excelling in certain areas based on their genetic profile?
That's definitely a possibility. Of course, it's important to remember that genes are only one piece of the puzzle. Our environment and our choices play a huge role as well.
Right.
But having this genetic information could be incredibly valuable for early intervention and personalized support.
It really feels like we're entering a whole new era of personalized medicine, where treatments and interventions can be tailored to your unique genetic makeup. And that raises some interesting ethical questions, doesn't it?
Absolutely. As with any powerful technology, we need to think carefully about the potential implications and make sure we're using this knowledge responsibly and ethically.
You're right. It's crucial to have those conversations as this research progresses. We need to think about things like genetic privacy, the potential for discrimination, and the very idea of what it means to be normal in a world where we have access to so much genetic information.
Those are all critical points. And it's a reminder that science is not just about making discoveries, it's about engaging with the ethical and societal implications of those discoveries. It's about using our knowledge wisely to create a better future for everyone.
Well said. And speaking of the future, what other exciting breakthroughs do you see on the horizon in this field?
One area that I'm particularly excited about is the development of new gene editing technologies. These tools, like CRISPR-Cas9, allow scientists to precisely alter DNA sequences, potentially offering a way to correct genetic defects that contribute to disease.
Wait, so you're saying that we might be able to actually edit our genes to prevent or cure diseases?
It does sound like something straight out of a sci-fi movie, and it's a testament to how far science has come. Of course, gene editing is still in its early stages, and there are many ethical and safety considerations to address, but the potential benefits are enormous. Imagine a world where we could eliminate genetic diseases like cystic fibrosis, Huntington's disease, and even certain types of cancer. Is an incredibly exciting prospect.
It is, but it also raises a lot of complex questions, like who would have access to this technology, and how do we ensure that it's used safely and ethically? It's like opening Pandora's box, isn't it?
It is, and it's why we need to have open and honest conversations about these technologies as they develop. We need to involve scientists, ethicists, policymakers, and the public in these discussions to ensure that we're using these powerful tools for the benefit of humanity.
You're right. We can't just focus on the scientific advancements without considering the broader societal implications. But going back to the research itself, one thing that's really struck me is how this approach is shifting our focus from simply finding the gene for something to understanding the intricate mechanisms involved. It's like the difference between knowing that a key unlocks a door and understanding the intricate mechanics of how the tumblers align to make that happen.
That's a great analogy. And this mechanistic understanding is what will allow us to develop truly effective interventions, whether it's through targeted therapies or behavioral interventions, or even just personalized advice and support.
I'm starting to see how this kind of research could really change the game, not just in mental health, but in so many areas of life. Education, personal development, even things like economics and policy making could all benefit from a deeper understanding of how our genes contribute to these individual differences in behavior.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that we're all unique and our genes play a role in shaping who we are. But it's not about determinism. It's about understanding the possibilities and limitations that our genes provide. and then using that knowledge to empower ourselves and each other.
That's a powerful message. And it's definitely given me a lot to think about. But before we get too carried away, I think it's important to remember that this research is still in its early stages.
There's still so much we don't know. But the progress that's been made in recent years is truly remarkable. And the future of this field is incredibly exciting.
I completely agree. This deep dive has definitely sparked a whole new level of curiosity for me. And I'm sure our listeners are feeling the same way.
Me too. And I think it's important for everyone to engage with these ideas, to ask questions, and to be part of the conversation as this research continues to unfold.
But before we wrap up, I feel like we need to bring this back to you, the listener. What does all this research actually mean for how you understand yourself and your decisions?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's one that researchers are still grappling with.
Yeah.
We're starting to understand that your genes can kind of nudge you in certain directions, but it's not a deterministic relationship. It's not like your genes dictate every choice you make.
Right, you still have free will.
Exactly. You still have free will. Your genes provide like a framework, a set of possibilities, but how those possibilities play out depends on a whole host of other factors. Your environment, your experiences, your choices. It's this dynamic interplay that makes each of us unique.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, it's not about using genetics to excuse our behavior. It's about gaining a deeper understanding of the biological factors that might be contributing to who we are and how we act.
Precisely. It's about self-awareness, not self-justification. So, for example, if you know that you tend to be more impulsive, and research suggests that there might be a genetic component to that impulsivity, it doesn't mean that you're off the hook. It just means that you can be more mindful of that tendency and develop strategies to manage it.
So it's almost like having a superpower. Once you know your strengths and weaknesses, you can use that knowledge to your advantage.
That's a great way to think about it. It's about empowering yourself with knowledge. And this kind of research can also help us to be more understanding and compassionate towards others. You know, if we recognize that everyone has a different genetic blueprint, we might be less quick to judge or blame when someone acts in a way that we don't understand.
That's a really powerful message. It's a reminder that we're all wired a little differently. And those differences are what make the world such a fascinating and diverse place.
Absolutely. And as this research continues to unfold, it's going to challenge our assumptions about human nature and what it means to be an individual.